Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. To start, let's introduce Jean-Daniel Ruch, whose career spans decades in diplomacy, including key postings in Turkey, Israel, and the Balkans. We will discuss what led him to write his new book, Crimes, Hate, and Tremors, and explore firsthand experience in navigating complex geopolitical crises. Ambassador Ruch, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me there.
Welcome, Ambassador.
Hello, Hovik, how are you?
Great, and great to have you on our show. Ambassador, in one interview, you described that you started writing your memoirs, Crimes, Hates, and Tremors, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was a very interesting read for me personally, and the link to the book for our listeners will be available in the show notes, and we will also show a barcode if you're watching this on screen, and you can scan that and go to the book. But I wanted to ask, what inspired you to start writing your book, and especially the timing of it?
Anger. I'm somebody who gets angry when I see foolish, unjust, wrong things happening in the world. So you can say I can be angry all the time, but okay. I think I know how to be angry. I think anger is a great inspiration. I really got that from my former boss at the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, Carla Del Ponte, who was a kind of icon of justice back then. And she was an angry woman because she knew the suffering of the victims of a war. And when I saw the aggression, I think that's the right word to qualify what Russia has been doing, I was angry for two reasons. I was obviously angry that this invasion took place, but I was also angry because I don't think that the West put enough resources, determination, and willingness to prevent that from happening. We know that the Minsk agreements were never really put in place. We know that there were openings in December 21 by Russia. And I really wonder whether it would not have been possible at that time to establish a serious dialogue with the Russians to prevent them from doing what they have wrongly been doing afterwards. So that was the first trigger, if you want. And the second trigger was 6 weeks later, when I was really a little bit involved in the talks in Turkey. And I heard from the Turkish negotiators that they were really close to have an agreement for a ceasefire, but that there were some powers who are not interested in a ceasefire because they have a global agenda. I think these were the words which were used. And it was pretty clear whom they were meaning. Then Boris Johnson went there and the talks collapsed. And then I had another, not quite heart attack, but symbolically also. And I said, my goodness, when you have an opportunity to stop a war at the beginning, don't miss that opportunity, because I could see that this would result in massive casualties, both human but also material destructions that would last quite a long time, and that would wipe off a whole generation of young Ukrainian men mostly, and also, of course, Russians. But obviously, Ukraine would be much, much more badly hit. And I found that irresponsible, immoral and irresponsible not to stop that war when it was possible. And these were the two things that triggered me to write about justice and peace, basically. And the title is, the editor needed to have some sort of an attractive title, but it's really about what I try to do for justice and peace in the various arenas where I was involved, many Balkans, mostly Balkans, Middle East, and a little bit also the Turkey and the surrounding regions.
And looking back at your career, what moments shaped your perspective and your worldview?
I would say my worldview was very much shaped when I started to work for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, in Vienna, in 1994. I was obviously a junior diplomat back then, when we had the first presidency of the OSCE by Switzerland. And there were, of course, many issues, many regional issues, including in the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. not sure if it's the right formula for your public, if I should say Artsakh.
We frequently refer to both. We use it interchangeably, but we appreciate Artsakh is near and dear to us.
In the OSCE, the formula was the conflict dealt with by the Minsk conference. They could not agree on a geographical denomination. But these were the times where democracy was taking root in Eastern Europe, and the OSCE was playing a really important role in helping organize free and fair elections, in bringing rule of law in the countries of Eastern Europe. And I became then convinced that that democracy was not only bringing order, democratic order in a society for the interest of the people, but I was also convinced back then that democracy would bring peace, that two democracies do not wage war one against the other. So I was very much committed to bringing democracy. And then with democracy, obviously, comes also the sense of justice and peace. So this was really what shaped my worldview. Then, of course, with time passing, you realize that the dream we had back then to establish, it's a bit Fukuyama, democracy will win, it will be the end of history. We quickly lost our illusions that democracy in the Western sense of the word would prevail all over Europe. I mean, the big Europe.
Planet.
Yeah, well, the planet, I don't know. I don't think anybody had ever any expectations to bring democracy to North Korea or to China, certainly not Western style of governance. But then you realize that okay, things are possible, things are not possible. And that preaching democracy from a Western perspective with Western money is not conducive to really bringing about democracy. The governance system of countries is something which is organic. And if a country or if the population of a country feels badly mistreated, really badly mistreated, then it's up to them to find the ways to reform their system of governance. But it cannot be imposed from outside. I think Chirac once said in the wake of the Iraq War of 2003, when the Americans invaded Iraq, also an act of aggression in my view, the Chirac, the French president, said you cannot bring democracy with cannons. And I think that's what has become pretty clear. So I have become a bit more realist in geopolitics. And I think the most important thing is to try to preserve or bring about stability and peace, and as much as possible, justice for the victims of war. It's has sort of been shaping my worldview.
And Ambassador, you had an illustrious career in the foreign ministry of Switzerland, serving as ambassador, as we said, Israel, Turkey, but then it ended abruptly, and some private information was either published about you, or we understand there may have been threats to publish some information. In the book, you seem to have arrived at the conclusion that the information was real and covered 10 years of your private life. And you reasoned that this couldn't have been work of individuals or amateurs, and you believe a state actor was involved. In the end, your candidacy for a prominent position, a newly created post at the Defense Ministry called Secretary for State Security Policy, was discontinued. And you write that after that, you made a decision to leave the ministry completely. So without disclosing any details that you do not feel comfortable about, can you tell us some warning lessons about personal security, especially as an ambassador? I mean, 10 years is a long period of time. So, what should future aspiring ambassadors know about your experience?
It's difficult to really draw lessons because that was a very specific case. These kind of, how do you call that, a spying file, let's say, reached some media in Switzerland. It was purely for political reasons. And I mean, there are many examples in the world of political assassinations of that sort. I think before you take a job, you have to assess extremely well what are the political forces at play, who you might antagonize with your positions, and then try to very early on, even before you are appointed, reach out to these powerful players and make sure they will not sabotage your nomination. I was appointed by our cabinet, and then immediately there were some circles who were really, really afraid of that. I think it's mostly for two reasons. One of them is that I was a NATO skeptical. And these are times when because of the Ukraine war, there was like a kind of rush towards NATO, not joining NATO because Switzerland wants to remain at least nominally neutral, but to cooperate so closely with NATO that it would be almost similar to being a member without the Article 5 guarantees, of course. And I took a position within the system, but everybody knew my position. And I guess that antagonized some powerful circles who then had access to this kind of files. So I'm afraid to say, well, you need to make a good assessment. I would not like to say you have to exert self-censorship. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, this is what I see with my colleagues in this atmosphere of today, where many have really the feeling that we live in a global fight of the good against the evil. Well, now that Trump is back in power in Washington, it's a bit different, let's say. But, you know, democracy is against autocracy, is good against evil, Putin is the evil, and so on. With such a mindset, there is a tendency to exert self-censorship. And I think this is not good, because when you do self-censorship, you tend to give wrong informations or wrong assessments to your political leaders, and then they make wrong strategies and wrong decisions. Typically, in the case of Europe, you can talk about the sanctions against Russia. These sanctions have hurt the European economy badly, maybe more than the Russian economy, and it has not had any impact on Russia's willingness, determination to continue that war. So, what the sanctions? What was the use of these? So, but I'm pretty sure that in most Western bureaucracies, be it defense, intelligence, or foreign affairs, very few were the people who dare to say, no, sanctions are bad, this is wrong. Let's try to talk to the Russians so that we can stop that war, they can withdraw their troops, and then we find some global security arrangement. If you would have said that in March 2022, there was a high risk for your career. And so I think that's the lesson I would draw before you accept a job or you apply for a job. I did not apply; they really came to me. Then you should make sure that you know who might be your enemies, and try to reach out to them and to secure your position before you have it. That's for me the main lesson. Otherwise, if they want to spy your bedroom, what can you do with the modern technologies? There is really not much you can do. And I did nothing illegal. There was never any investigation, be it administrative, disciplinary, or criminal, whatever.
My shock to me, you said there was you requested a file, and the government of Switzerland had nothing in that file. They did not conduct any investigation against you, but did they treat this as a crime, and did they pursue to investigate?
No. Actually, I think it was taken as a good excuse for the defense minister who was not really involved in the selection procedure. And I'm not sure she liked the fact that I came as the best candidate and I was proposed by the commission, but she had committed herself before to accept whatever proposal would come from the committee, from the recruitment committee. So I think that she was very happy to have an opportunity to ask me not to take the job. And when your boss, your future potential boss, is telling you, I don't want you, you don't think you can really force your destiny and say, no, I'm going to do it after. And by the way, now I enjoy is maybe not the right term, but a kind of victory or posthumous victory, because all those people who who were sort of against me are resigning one after the other. Actually, we have a huge crisis this week in Switzerland because in January, the defense minister resigned. And the day before yesterday, it was announced that the head of the army and the head of the intelligence are also resigning because of the chaos they have created in the Swiss defense system. So at the end of the day, I sort of come out with this rather well.
Oh, and very quickly, would you ever consider going back to your diplomatic career at some point in the future?
Frankly, I would do that only with guarantees that I can implement the strategy that I think is in the interest of Switzerland and not in the interest of any particular group or foreign country. So I would like to have a lot of freedom and also the capacity, including the financial capacity, to implement what I think is in our interest or in the interest of peace or justice in the places where I have a competence.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very, very rare capability nowadays. And that leads me to my next question that I wanted to ask you. In your book, you write about the Goldstone report after the Israeli campaign. Was it called Iron?
No, Castled.
Yeah, the Castled campaign. And a prominent judge, Goldstone, wrote a report, very well received. I mean, it was a very detailed report. And you went to the United States to plead with Samantha Power, who is the author of the classic book, A Problem from Hell. And in fact, Armenians know her as well and have hitherto respected her because the Armenian genocide is featured prominently in her book. But we were disappointed with her for various different reasons. I would say, I'll say later. But you were also very disappointed, especially with her, because of her bona fides that she had presented. And you quote her saying to you, like when you were saying that, let the Goldstone report go through, she told you, before I was an activist, and I would have said, of course. Now I'm a bureaucrat, and I'm telling you I'm going to make a report. And the US government proceeded essentially to either let the report die or not give any sort of credence to it. Was she the US ambassador to UN at the time when you talked to her?
No. At the time, she was an advisor of Obama.
So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what is the delineating line between a diplomat, an activist, and a bureaucrat?
Well, I think statesmen and women are the three things at the same time. They must have the guts, the vision, and the compass, the moral compass of an activist. They must have the skills of navigating the bureaucracy and knowing how to manage the bureaucracy and sometimes manipulate it. It's about power at the end of the day. And they need to have for that the skills of a diplomat, meaning knowing how to feel a situation, how to express your positions in a non-confrontational way to the other people, but still how to make your points and how to talk to people and have this kind of subtlety that is expected from a diplomat. And I think that the combination of these three skills produces great diplomats like, I'm thinking of George Kennan now, I don't know why, there are of course many other examples. And there are many examples of great diplomats who are unknown, but who played a tremendous positive roles also. But if
yes,
I
well
come back
said.
to the Goldstone report one second, I think it was a missed opportunity for several reasons. At that time, the ICC was not yet fully operational and had certainly no competence over Palestine or Israel. Now it has. Now it's a different situation. So that's why the UN tasked, the Human Rights Council of the UN actually tasked Justice Goldstone, who had been a hero of the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and the first or the second prosecutor of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, and a Jew, to investigate the crimes committed in Gaza in those days. And I'm pretty sure that if there had been some accountability for the crimes committed there, also with very large amounts of civilians, women and children who died or who were wounded. I'm pretty sure that if the Americans had supported this report, and we're talking about the Obama, not Bush, not Trump, about the Obama,
Right.
who himself was sort of presented himself as the white knight of peace and justice in the world and had the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sure that this would have been a very powerful signal for the future, and that might have helped to put the negotiation process and maybe peace on a good track, and maybe to prevent further violence between Israelis and Palestinians, or at least that this violence would have been better contained, because especially the Israeli army might have changed their rules of engagement and might have had a totally different approach than the one we have seen in Gaza recently.
Indeed.
So that was really a missed opportunity on many counts.
Ambassador, you mentioned the OSCE a little bit earlier. It played a key role in shaping post-Cold War Europe, yet its effectiveness has been debated. One key moment was the 1999 Istanbul summit, where Bill Clinton challenged Boris Yeltsin over Chechnya. This moment may have marked the beginning of a deeper rift between Russia and the West, as you note in your book. How did the OSCE function in that period?
Yeah, for those who are interested, I try to give a kind of living description of this exchange between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. I was in the room, and it was quite I mean, even funny to some extent. I mean, you can read that in the book. But basically, what happened is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were several attempts by the Russians to create a new treaty-based security organization in Europe, where they will be considered as an equal with the United States. Actually, in their mind, they wanted a treaty-based organization, but they wanted also a Security Council where they would have a permanent seat together with the US and other major European countries. Ideally, they would have liked also to abolish NATO, since the Warsaw Pact had been dismissed.
Dissolved, yeah.
Dissolved, yes. But the Americans had obviously, and the Western world with them, totally different views. Quite the opposite. They thought we have to advance our positions as long as Russia is weak. And I think the divorce or the moment when it was clear for the Russians that any deal along the lines of what they wanted would be impossible was in Istanbul, where a charter of security was approved, but which was really saying nothing. It was saying at the same time every country should be free to access any security arrangement, meaning everybody is free to join NATO. And on the other hand, there was a sentence saying there should no new dividing line should be created in Europe. But these are not just political commitments. This is basically blah blah. And back then it was clear already that the US wanted to advance NATO as much as possible. Now I think the red line was crossed with Ukraine, because I think the Russians were still expecting, and it certainly passed to Washington. There is a report, by the way, from 2008 by then Ambassador in Russia, Bill Burns, who is, I think, still the CIA director, or probably maybe soon to be replaced, who said, a no is a no, and yet is a yet. WikiLeaks has shown us this report. And I think he was right. The Russians were very clear. Don't mess with Ukraine. Don't try to bring Ukraine into NATO, either de facto or de jure, because that's a red line for us. And for some reason, the Americans, the West, the rest just followed, the French, the Brits, the Germans. And I think the Americans did not take that seriously, or maybe they wanted to provoke a confrontation. I don't think they wanted to provoke. I think they thought they could get through with their positions. These were the days when you had Mrs. Nuland, of course, who had sometimes maybe strong personal and emotional interests to bring Ukraine into NATO. So I think that the OSCE, yes, you cannot say the OSCE has failed, because an organization is always the sum of its member states. But what is clear is that at one point that there was no willingness really, or no agreement of minds to deal equally with Russia and to treat Russia as an equal on the West, and on the Russian side. The only thing that matters really is to be taken seriously as a power which is equal to the United States. So those two conceptions could not match. Now we're in a different world. It seems that Trump and Putin have I would say, a good relationship, or at least are trying to re-establish one. It seems that Trump is taking Putin much more seriously as a kind of partner than any Democratic government that we've seen before, or even Bush. So let's see, maybe there is a chance now to have a totally different governance system of the world. But unfortunately, it will not be based on international law or rules as it could have been within the context of the OSCE. It will be based on power arrangements between the major powers, China, Russia, the United States, and then probably the others will just have to follow the diktats coming from there. This is the kind of world we seem to be seeing appearing.
Yeah. You said that the OSCE has not really failed, but would you say it has been effective in maintaining peace in the region?
Not at all, but it's a little bit like the Security Council. Any international organization is the result of agreements or disagreements between the main states, between the big powers. And if the OSCE has not been effective, it's because of the totally different ambitions, strategies, objectives of the big powers. And the result has been an organization which has been paralyzed, let's say, since maybe the last time they played a really useful role in diffusing the conflict was in 2014. Actually, we had the presidency again, Switzerland, and the work of the OSCE presidency led to the Minsk agreements, led to the deployment of a monitoring mission. So it really helped to stop the fighting back then. But ever since, I haven't seen the OSCE being very effective. They have all sorts of problems even to pass a budget. And I think for the Russians, it has become clear that from their point of view, the OSCE has become a vector of American influence. And of course, there is no way they want to support that. But look, the Security Council has been dysfunctional. What is the last time that the Security Council took really a decision that mattered in terms of peace and security? Maybe it was when they allowed the use of force in Libya in 2011, which did not help peace and security in the world, certainly not in Libya.
Yeah,
but
and I'm not even sure that was the right thing to do, even if they were effective in agreeing to do it.
But at least they agreed on something.
Right.
And then from the Russian point of view, they overstretched the mandate to attack the government or to help the rebellion, which was not in the mandate. But okay, but anyway, between 2011 and I would say this week, we're talking late February, early March 2024, the Security Council has been very dysfunctional because the Russians said there is no way we are going to give any mandate to the West anymore to do anything. And then suddenly this week, the Security Council makes a decision which is unique. The Russians and the Americans pushed a resolution for peace in Ukraine, and the 5 European members of the Security Council abstained. The British and the French could have said no, that would have been a veto. They didn't go that far, but it's quite remarkable that I think maybe for the first time in the history of the United Nations, the Russians and the Americans agree on something, and then the 5 European members are not in line with the Americans. So there is some hope that the Security Council might become functional again. And if the Security Council, why not the OSCE in the future? I think it will depend a lot about the result of the bilateral talks between Moscow and Washington. I'm not sure they are going to reach an agreement, but part of the agreement could be to revitalize the OSCE as an important element of European security. For instance, as a framework for negotiating arms control agreements.
Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago Western efforts to promote democracy and American influence. This particularly happens through funding opposition movements or propping up undemocratic yet subservient regimes. For example, through entities like the USAID. And this often blurs the line between genuine support and external interference. This has played out in multiple places, from Serbia, Egypt, Ukraine, Armenia. How does one distinguish between legitimate democracy support and foreign interference?
Well, this question has definitely popped in my mind even after I wrote the book, because in the book I talk about how because we are also part of it with, of course, the Americans, but many others, helped to overthrow the rule of Slobodan Milosevic, who was back then the president. Some people say dictator, but I would say he was sort of a mild dictator within Serbia. I'm not speaking about his role in the war crimes in Bosnia or Kosovo. But there was an opposition. There were media, opposition media, NGOs. So it was much more liberal, if you want, as a regime than certainly Russia today. So, but Slobodan Milosevic was an indicted war criminal, and therefore I personally thought that it was right to try to do whatever would be possible to bring about changes, democratic changes in Serbia. Then I think many of these dictatorships, they have learned a lesson from Serbia, Serbia was actually maybe the first color revolution. Then we had Georgia, we had Ukraine, there were others. And dictators, I think the tide started to turn in Syria, because you can say that in Syria, the method or the procedure was about the same, meaning that civil society organizations started a popular movement in the main city, in the capital, with demonstrations. And the idea is that this could lead to the fall of the Assad house. But Assad reacted brutally, but really brutally, as we see that every day with the news from the prisons, for instance, that come from Syria. And he really crushed that rebellion. So I think there we really saw the limits of this kind of movements. I think they work and they are legitimate when you don't run any opposition movement, but you support movements of the civil society which are legitimate. And then it can work only when you have a real mass movement. And when you have a mass movement, it means that the people really want that and are sufficiently concerned so as to want democratic change. So I think it's a fine line. For me, I think it's worth supporting such movement from the civil society. We never supported political parties and, of course, never supported armed movements, but civil society organizations. But we did that also in the name of democracy and human rights and the rule of law, because we always try to support movements who were trying to promote democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Certainly in Serbia, that was the case. So that's maybe the first thing. It's about democracy and human rights. And second, it really needs to meet the aspirations of the people. And that you can measure by the number of the people who are involved, the strength of the civil society organizations. Plus, this is even more legitimate, in my view, when the rulers that the people want, it's organic. It's not you imposing something. It's organic. So when the people are fighting against a regime which is criminal, as was the case in Serbia in those days. So I don't regret what we did. But nowadays, I would be much more prudent, obviously, when assessing whether it's legitimate or not.
So I do have a question about that, because, as we saw in Ukraine, what was initially thought to be democratic protests were actually very, in an underhanded way, sponsored by the United States, and non-democratic things happened. Can it really work in the way that it is being implemented right now? And what lessons can Armenia draw? And also, in the case of Armenia, we can say that in 2018, when the so-called Velvet Revolution, or I would say Velvet Coup, happened, it was also a similar case where the former regime was being presented as autocratic, very bad. So therefore, it's good to remove them. But today, arguably, what the current regime is doing is as undemocratic as the previous regime. Obviously, can this type of foreign funding really work, or should what Georgia did be on the menu for other smaller countries, like maybe have a foreign agent law, so at least we know where all this funding is coming from?
Yes, I don't think you can accuse. You could have accused in 2014 the incumbent president to have stolen the election. You could not really accuse him of being a criminal either. Actually, democracy in Ukraine between 91 and 2014, I would say it worked pretty well. I mean, there were elections, often pro-Russian, or let's say people who were balanced, were elected, also with the votes, by the way, of the parts of Ukraine which have now been annexed by Russia, which were usually systematically, also Crimea, systematically voting for the candidate which was, let's say, more sympathetic towards Russia. So I don't really see the legitimacy that there was of toppling that president. Yanukovych was his name, if I'm not mistaken. And we see a little bit the same scenario in Georgia, except that in Georgia it looks like there is not enough, I think, interest or support on the side of the West to provoke a revolution, or maybe they're just not unable to do that. But we see a little bit the same pattern, in the sense that the EU is offering an agreement with that country, Ukraine and now Georgia, but the consequence must be severing some trade links with Russia. And this, I think, is not a responsible proposition. I mean, how can you not allow countries like Ukraine and Georgia to enjoy good relationships, or Armenia, to enjoy good relationships with both? I mean, the geography makes the destiny. And okay, we are lucky because nowadays our neighbor with Switzerland, because nowadays our neighbors are in peace with each other. It was not always the time in history, the French or Germans. But the key to our success has been that we could maintain a decent relationship with both the French and the German. I think our neutrality helped a lot also in keeping our national cohesion, especially during the First World War, where there were really tensions between French speakers and German speakers. And for me, this is my understanding of what is normal, that any country sovereignty should be respected, and big powers should show some understanding for smaller countries who are sort of caught between two big powers, that they can enjoy good relations with both. And I think this is really very much the question today, not just with Ukraine. Ukraine, it went, as we know, extremely, worse it could not have been, probably. But this is a big question today in Moldova. We've seen that in the recent elections, Maia Sandu won really by a very thin margin, and also because they did not really allow all the Moldovans living in Russia to vote, while allowing many Moldovans who live in Western Europe to vote. So it was very much the outside vote that determined the election, but still it's a divided society. Same thing with Georgia. It's a divided society. So I think that there should be some understanding of the great powers, that they should leave these countries to enjoy the benefits, to be in the middle, and to do trade and to have good relations with both of them. I really, there is something in the theory of negotiations that whenever you have a negotiation, you should not look at a negotiation as a zero-sum game. Either I win or you win. And if I win, you lose. We have to look at win-win theories and at win-win practices and a solution. And for that, you cannot have a zero-sum game. And come on, what's the problem with having Georgia, Moldova, well, Ukraine is probably too late, to choose their own destiny and to allow them to be in between? You know, in our case, I think Switzerland, because I make the comparison because after the end of the Napoleonic wars, we were pretty much one of these countries, you know, caught between the warring parties, Austria on one side and France on the other. And there was, of course, always a risk that these tensions would reappear. And to try to protect us from these influences, not only we declared ourselves neutral, but the big powers in the Vienna Congress recognized our neutrality, and that was very important. So I think that's maybe one of the formula that could be used mostly for Moldova and Georgia. I don't know about Ukraine. I think that's what the Russians want. If you talk about neutrality for Ukraine, you are pro-Russian. But it seems to me that it's not a stupid idea to try to accept that some countries, okay, they are not in the West, they are not in NATO. Russia has to accept that they are not Russian puppets either, and let them be truly independent. But it seems that it's quite difficult for many people in positions of power to understand that some countries are neither with us or against us. They are neutral. We had that same problem, by the way, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because we were under very strong pressure in 2022, February 2022. We were under very strong pressure by the West to accept to take over the sanctions from the European Union, which we did finally, even though between 2014 and 22, we could live, saying that from our neutral perspective, we will not implement the EU sanctions, but we will make sure that the sanctions are not being circumvented through our territory. And it worked during 8 years. But then in 2022, these new teams in power in Brussels, in Europe, in the US, they had more mentality like it's a fight of good against evil, and well, you have to choose your side. I think this is a deeply wrong mindset.
Well, so as the Trump administration takes power, the cracks, or at least the perceived cracks, in the Western unity over the war in Ukraine have become more apparent. Trump has initiated dialogue with Russia, as you mentioned, yet the UK and the EU, they seem ever more allergic to minor attempts at diplomacy. Or maybe that's just my impression, I'm not sure. Why do you think they have been much more aggressive in prolonging this war than the US, for example?
You know, it's a bit difficult when you are a political leader to say during 3 years, we will fight till the end, we'll provide all the support, Russia will lose, we have to win over Russia, we'll bring Russia to its knees. And then suddenly to change the discourse and say, no, we need peace, that's okay, we'll make a deal with the Russians. You know, they have painted Putin as the devil. All these leaders, van der Leyen, Baerbock, Macron. Macron is a bit more of a smart operator, a little bit. But unfortunately, he's not taken very seriously neither by Trump nor by Putin. So it's a bit difficult, you know, to be so consistent in saying something and suddenly to say something different. As a politician, you know, you would be accused of contradicting yourself or not being serious. So I understand why they are really caught by surprise, and they don't know how to react. I mean, actually, they react with an amazing cacophony. I think at the end of the day, they will have no choice but to follow through what the Russians and the Ukrainian and the Americans, and probably the Ukrainians will have to get involved at one point, but they will have to accept what will be decided by the bigger powers. And it's really a shame, because the Europeans could have developed a much smarter policy, because, you know, a simple assessment of your interests shows that it's impossible for Europe to have the same national security interests as the United States. There is an ocean, by God's sake, 6,000 kilometers. It's a totally different situation. A great part of the economic success of Germany and Europe was built on the cheap gas and oil and energy bought from Russia. Cutting yourself has, as a result, inflation, lack of competitiveness, especially also in the car industry, that you have to compensate with higher taxes on Chinese cars and things like that. It cannot be in our long-term interest to have a kind of new iron wall between Russia and the West. I heard Jeffrey Sachs, probably you all know Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who was one of the advisors to many government, former communist government, including Russia, in the 90s, who was sort of exhorting European leaders, by God's sake, don't go to Washington, go to Moscow.
But, that's right, even in 1991.
Yeah. But he's saying that now. He's saying that now to Macron and van der Leyen, don't go to Washington, go to Moscow, because this is with Moscow that you have to reestablish decent connections. And I don't think that we can afford to wait until there will be a regime change in Moscow, because nobody knows, A, if and when a regime change will occur, and B, who will be the next leader. It may be both. It may be even a more nationalist and militarist and revanchist, people would say revisionist leader as President Putin. So I think that the problem lies really with the psychology of the European leaders. It's hard for them to make a 180 degrees change. It's possible when you have a new government. Let's see what happens in Germany. They will have soon a new government. The new chancellor has been elected. We will see what happens. Okay, France, the elections are a bit far away. But I think but French has sort of more flexibility in their minds, let's say, traditionally. Macron tried to reach out to Putin at the beginning of the war. Just he was not taken seriously. But I think that if Merz, by the way, Merz's first visit, even before he's a chancellor, was his Macron. So he shows that he really wants to try to restart the European engine, and the European engine in history has always been the connection between French and German leaders. So I think if those two manage to agree on a number of strategic things, like how do we manage Russia, and second, how do we build a serious defense capability in Europe, then it can really boost the power, the influence, and the credibility,
and the independence.
And the independence. Yeah, that's what Macron called that the strategic autonomy. And actually, the first time he used that word was in 2017, actually when Trump was starting his first mandate, when he said that NATO was brain dead also. So this is not new. It has been long-standing French desire, but they were a bit the only ones, because the British were always very much closer to the US. And traditionally, the Germans were also very much under the American influence. But now we have this new chancellor who has been saying, surprisingly to me, because he's known as an Atlantist, but he has been saying on election night, that is clear we cannot count on the Americans, and that Europe has to acquire its independence in security and defense terms. So I think there are some promising moves, but it will take time until they really manage to build a serious capacity.
Yeah, I agree with that. On the other side of the Atlantic, of course, I think that even Trump has wised up a little bit and is no longer saying that he will leave NATO. He just wants other people to pay more of their share. And I think it's perhaps because they've realized that if they have such an independent Europe, they'll probably just tell America to pack up its bases and go home. There's no need for them on the continent.
I'm not sure they will say that. If I may just interject this, there are two reasons why they will not say that. The first thing is that the nuclear umbrella will remain of paramount importance. I don't see Europe developing the kind of nuclear capability with ICBMs and all the number and the size of the weapons that the US has. So from that point of view, I think. And then the second thing is that economically, in terms of trade and investments, Europe and the US are really, really deeply interlinked, and I think that will stay that will remain as an important political and geostrategic factor also.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Trump has taken the lead in the Ukraine issue. Now he's demanding the rights to $500 billion of so-called mineral rights in Ukraine, because as he says, the US has sunk $350 billion in Ukraine with nothing in return. And of course, Europe has also put in another $100 billion more. Now, you can say that this is actually Trump's transactional style of foreign policy negotiations, but given that the US and the UK were the key agents in failing Istanbul 3 years ago, as you talked a little bit about, who owes whom $500 billion? Who bears responsibility for 3 years of unnecessary war? I mean, if you ask me, this sounds a little bit like a classical colonial situation, a resource grab in a country that became the battlefield for a proxy war between two major powers and just got caught in the middle.
And of course, if we keep referring to the war starting in 3 years ago, but if you ask the Russians, they will say the war started in 2014.
Yeah,
and the trigger for that was the regime change operation, Euromaidan, and so forth. So in any case, it was the US and the UK still, maybe more the US, that was responsible for that.
Well, okay, there are the root causes and there are the immediate causes. And I think you can make a difference between who is guilty. And for me, if you speak of guilt in terms of criminal law, then definitely the Russians are guilty for invading another country, which is a violation of the Charter of the UN and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But now the distinction between guilt and responsibility is that definitely NATO enlargement, or NATO or the US, has a very high responsibility in these developments. Now, to come to the bombastic Trump statements, I think we are used to this bombastic statement. I'm not sure I would take them so seriously. I mean, of course, that makes you a bit afraid as a prime minister of Denmark when he says, I want to buy Greenland from you, and otherwise I will raise tariffs or do all sorts of retortions. But or Canada should become the 51st state, or I want to take back the Panama Canal. But I think in these negotiations, the basics is look at what is the true interest behind those let's say, a bit bold, insane negotiation tactics, if you want. For me, this is a negotiation tactics. You ask for a lot, but really a lot, totally unrealistic demands. But then there is something reasonable you might agree to at the end of the day. So I guess this is what Zelensky is doing. He's looking at what are the true interests of the Americans. I think everybody knows that the Ukrainians will never repay the debt, be it 100 million or 100 billion or 500 billion. I really don't see how this totally destroyed economy could do that. And so the Europeans, I hope, will not pay the Americans back for what they deliver to Ukraine, but you never know with the Europeans.
Maybe this is what the 100-year agreement with the UK is all about. It'll take them 100 years to pay their debt.
That would be foolish. No, I don't think this is a serious proposal. But what is a serious interest, and I think they can achieve something, is that probably Zelensky will have to, or will agree at one point, to give concessions for these rare earth to American companies to do the mining simply. And I think that's what Trump wants at the end of the day. This is an interest, a clear national interest of the US to have more access to rare minerals in the world. And there is a fierce competition between the key powers, China, for access and control of these very precious minerals and materials, which are so important in the high tech. I mean, computer and iPhones and all the things that we use every day. So I guess this is the true interest behind those bombastic statements. And I'm not sure Zelensky will have much choice but to agree to allow American companies to do the mining there. Now there is a bit of a small problem. As far as I understand, yes, Ukraine is relatively rich in such products, raw materials, but most of them are in the zone under Russian occupation. I'm told about 70% of these rare minerals are more in the Donetsk, in the eastern part of Russia. So I assume that this could or should also be part of the talks now between Washington and Moscow. And actually, it would be a very smart move from Washington if they can convince Moscow to allow American companies to go and do some mining, maybe in partnership with Russian companies. That would, from the American point of view, that would sort of try to bring Russia farther away from China. I think it's a bit the Kissinger policies, to try to play Russia against China. If they manage to do that, fine. I'm just not sure it will be possible because on the one hand, the connections between China and Russia now are extremely strong. So I'm not sure how the Chinese would react if the Russians would allow American companies. But maybe even more importantly, it would mean that the sanctions should be lifted. And I mean, that would be, and of course, that would be the most bizarre scenario. If the Americans would lift, maybe not all the sanctions, but, re-allowing Russian banks in the SWIFT system, in the dollar system, and then waiving some trade sanctions, and also waiving sanctions against certain individuals. I mean, that would be another earthquake for the Europeans because they would be the only ones left. And as far as I understand, to lift the sanctions against Russia, I think they need unanimity of the member states, and to convince the Poles or the Baltic states or the Swedes to lift sanctions against Russia, I think it will be very, very, very difficult. But this is maybe the kind of transaction that Trump has in mind. There is a strategy behind these bombastic statements. That's really what I want to say. And you have to look always at the psychology of Trump, of course, but also what are the true interests.
Ambassador, in your book, a statement you wrote really struck a chord with us. You write, international justice depends on the great powers and their interests. And of course, you spent a considerable time at the ICC. We know that one of the first things that Trump did coming to power was to sanction the ICC and its officers. The US has historically evaded accountability while imposing legal frameworks for other nations. How do you see the role of the ICC today and in the future? And how can international justice really be fair in this environment?
I think we are really at a crossroads regarding international justice. Just to be precise, I worked in the two pioneering undertakings in international justice that preceded the creation of the International Criminal Court, which was one, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Okay.
And second, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And the person for whom I worked, the prosecutor, Carla Del Ponte, she was, when I arrived, the prosecutor for both tribunals, so both situations. And what I have realized there is that it was extremely difficult to investigate against the allies of the West. I remember a meeting in Washington in the office of the war crimes ambassador. They had a position like that, where he put a piece of paper in front of Carla Del Ponte, the prosecutor, in a room with the Minister of Justice and the prosecutor of Rwanda. And it was a letter that he had written that she should have signed, which she was basically saying, I renounce to investigate the crimes committed by the people of Kagame. It was estimated between 80 and 200,000 casualties, which is not nothing. And we're talking about mostly civilian, not combatants. So it's much worse than Ukraine, or even much worse than Gaza. And they wanted Carla Del Ponte to stop her investigation and to entrust the prosecutor of Rwanda to investigate himself, basically, and his friends. So, of course, she refused, and 3 months later, she lost her mandate for Rwanda at the Security Council. So this is how it works. Similarly, when we're trying to investigate Kosovo-Albanian leaders, then there were all sorts of things that happened that made it impossible for us to really build robust indictments. And once I had a British diplomat in my home, actually, after dinner, she told me, you know, Jean-Daniel, we have nothing against you investigating the KLA, the Albanian, Kosovo-Albanian leaders, but we would like you to produce a robust indictment, and without our support, you will never manage to produce a robust indictment. And also the American support, because we talk to the Americans, we know they don't give you anything either. So, of course, this is power games in international justice. Now, I find it amazing that the ICC managed to indict Netanyahu and Gallant, because it was the first time that they directly indicted somebody who is allied to the West, especially to the United States. So it shows that there is a chance of independence, of true independence for international justice. This is a very powerful signal, because it means that it will be very difficult for Netanyahu or Gallant to travel in Europe. Now, this is again a case where we see a rift between Europe and the United States, and diverging interests between Europe and the United States. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, is mostly funded by Europe. And they have invested quite a lot. It's about $200 million per year, which is being spent mostly by European countries. Well, you know, it's you could, with the Pentagon budget, you could make 4,000 such tribunals every year, because it's 4,000 higher. So you can say it's not much, but still it has been a significant investment over the past 20 years. And really the future of international justice will depend on the determination and the stamina of the European leaders to continue to support that tribunal, and also to implement in good faith their obligations, meaning not to allow, for instance, Netanyahu to visit Paris or Prague.
But he was, of course, the first person to visit DC under Trump, and with a very triumphant visit as well.
Yes, you know, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so they are not bound by the rulings of the court, and therefore they are not bound by the arrest warrant against Netanyahu. So you cannot say they did something illegal. But I think again, I can quote John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs for saying that the American foreign policy in that region is very much directed from Israel itself. So I'm not surprised. It's a very, very strong partnership, and it has a lot to do with the domestic politics in the US. I think everybody understands that, and nobody would have expected anything different. What is, however, remarkable on the Middle East is that Trump managed to force Netanyahu to begin with the implementation of a deal, of a ceasefire agreement, which had been on the table since May. And Biden was never ready to invest the political capital to force Netanyahu to start implementing that deal. And Witkoff, I mean, a lot of credit to Witkoff and to Trump, because despite, again, all the bombastic statement about the Riviera in Gaza and all these idiotic things, the deal is still being implemented. I'm not sure how long it will last. It's super fragile, but prisoners are being released, hostages are being released, bodies are being returned. So far it works, and it is to the credit of the Trump administration.
Yeah, and they're going into phase 2 now, which was interesting.
I'm not sure that we manage to do that.
We'll see how it goes.
Yes, but it will require a lot of U.S. involvement, arm twisting, promises, threats, God knows. I think those who have, of course, the most to win in the implementation of that deal are Hamas. Hamas will appear as the victorious side there, despite the crazy casualties. But in the minds, I think, in the minds of many, maybe not rulers, but rulers are rather afraid, but people, the population, in Palestine and in the Arab world, they are like heroes because they are the ones who managed, they were not destroyed by the IDF. And that was remember, Netanyahu had two objectives: one, to destroy Hamas, and second, to release the hostages. He has failed on both counts.
If you don't mind, Ambassador, we want to come to our region, Armenia.
We actually had a whole section on Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood and the Middle East that we want to tackle.
We don't have time,
but because of time constraints, go ahead, Hovik.
We can do another time if you want.
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay, that'll be. We'll definitely take it. The rain check. I think it's really important because your Swiss example of neutrality. I really was fascinated by how you were able to keep neutral and negotiate with Hamas despite so much objection from Israel. So we would definitely want to cover that.
Yeah. Maybe we can say that there is a section in the book, in my book,
yes,
because we refer to my book. So for those who are interested to really understand how Hamas is working, truly beyond the ideology and the propaganda, you should read that section on the book, because I had lots of interaction, and actually it's much different than what you would read in most media.
Yeah, probably worth a show on its own. Definitely.
Okay, so the OSCE Minsk Group, it was established in 1994, I believe, and to help resolve the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh conflict, and throughout 2019, until 2019, it developed various different proposals. The co-chairs, of course, are the US, France, and Russia. In the late 1990s, you were a member of the Swiss delegation at the OSCE, and I don't know when Switzerland had the chairmanship of the OSCE.
96,
yeah.
And although 2014.
2014. Okay, and although Switzerland was not a member of the OSCE Minsk Group directly, I think that your experience could still be valuable to us. So I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what was the actual stance of Western actors on the status of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh in let's say before 2018? What was their intention? What was their goal?
Okay, well, I did not deal so directly with that, but what I can say is that in the mid-90s, there was true hope that this conflict would be solved in a meaningful way by a compromise solution. And I think, and many proposals were actually over the years, many proposals were put on the table by the Minsk group. But I think both sides were actually tough cookies, tough negotiators, and were not ready to give up. I think that the strategic fundamental change occurred when Azerbaijan started to receive the dividends of the oil and gas. It was 2002, 2003. And they used that money to build an army. And I think that the Azeris from that period, they lost interest in, of course, they continue to participate in meetings and to talk to people, etc. But actually what they have been doing since then is to build an army and to prepare for what happened recently. When was that? 2020?
23, September.
20. Well, 2020 and then 23, of course.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So they have been pursuing that strategy, in my view, for 20 years until they were ready. And frankly, when they did that already in 2000, still in 2020, at least there was some involvement by Russia and Turkey to try to stop the forces. But in 2023, there was nobody on the side of Armenia. And I think the Armenians, I never understood Armenia, to be quite honest, the positions of the Armenian government. Because even for me, who was an outsider, it was obvious that those were the very strong interest to find a compromise as soon as possible before the Azeri army would be that strong, were the Armenians. So I don't know, did they believe in the guarantees of the Russians? And then there were also some good relations with the Americans. Did they really believe that they would come to rescue them from the Azeri army? I think it's foolish to believe anything like that. And it's so they missed, really, I think they missed an opportunity several times to agree on a formula of autonomy. There were some formulas of autonomies for Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, which are de facto independence, but not de jure. And they should have shown a willingness to the big powers who were the members of the Minsk group, France, the Russia, and the United States. They should have, my view, and what I would have done when I'm the weaker part in a negotiation, I try to get the support of the mediators, especially when they represent the biggest powers in the region. And they did not do that. And for me, this is hard to understand what was the strategy of the various leaders, including the one you have now. No offense, but this is my perspective. Also with where I was a little bit more involved more recently when I was ambassador in Turkey, we're trying to think of confidence building measures between Armenia and Turkey. There was a very positive signal. It's that Pashinyan came to the inauguration of Erdogan, and also he allowed, or he was very quick at providing humanitarian assistance. Actually, they opened the border for the trucks to come from Armenia. Mm-hmm. Now, these were small steps, but meaningful steps on which both sides could have built. For instance, the kind of ideas I proposed to some people involved there. You know, I visited Ani, very important place for Armenian people, amazing site. And what I had not realized is that it's so close to Armenia. It's really at the border. And there is a small river, a bridge which has been destroyed, and then it's Armenia on the other side. Why not make a kind of binational recreation archaeological park, invite archaeologists from the University of Yerevan, do joint projects, allow the public to enter into Ani through a rebuilt bridge without any need for visa or passport or whatever, you know, this kind of things. And then, of course, there could have been some also movements in terms of trade or sports or things like that. But that would, when you are in it, looks so obvious that this is the kind of things which would be in the interest of both sides. And for some reason, these such ideas never flew, and I still don't quite understand why there is such a resistance.
I want to go back to what you said previously. I think that there was a general tendency for during the negotiations process, Azerbaijan was gaining strength and there was a trajectory. But I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the involvement of Turkey directly in the fighting in 2020. They supplied Syrian rebels or terrorists. In fact, Sultan Murad Group, which is part of the SNA, I believe, right now, participated in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, they provided intelligence. They provided even special forces,
drones.
So, yeah, everything. But I think my pet peeve is that they actually as a member of NATO, they would have access to all the NATO ISR. Perhaps I think perhaps our Armenians believed that if they were left one-on-one with Azerbaijan, it would be a bloody war, but they would still be able to resist. But the straw that broke the camel's back was Turkish involvement. And in your opinion, when was it clear internationally, from an outside observer's point of view, that Turkey would be involved in the next war in the region?
Well, don't forget that not only there is a very close connection between Turkey and Azerbaijan, but there is also a very close connection between Azerbaijan and Israel.
Yes.
So, I mean, with those two providing all sorts of intelligence toys and other type of support, I mean, you'd better have very strong allies on your side, because it's I mean, the force balance of forces is obviously on the side of Azerbaijan. The relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan became obvious. It's a complex relationship. It's not a relationship of big brother Turkey, younger brother Azerbaijan, not at all. It's a complex interlink, because because the Turks also depend on the Azeris for a number of things. They have also some influence in Turkey. For instance, I was a little bit involved in the Zurich protocols. You remember the Zurich protocols?
Yes.
Which were eventually signed after a lot of hesitation on the Armenian side. They were eventually signed in Zurich in 2009. And the Azeris forced Erdogan to reject the ratification of these protocols, which was a pity for the whole region, in my view. But that showed, I think, to everybody, when you asked me, when did you realize? I think then we realized, end of 2009, 2010, how much influence Azeri had over Turkey and how much Turkey was had to be or was a kind of faithful and loyal ally to Azerbaijan. And that a key to the relaxing or normalization of relation between Turkey and Armenia had to go through Baku, which is very unfortunate in my view, because that makes the whole game much more complicated, because I don't think that you will have much progress as long as Azeri demand for the Zangezur corridor will not be satisfied, or some compromise will not be found on this. And actually what I hope is that we will not have a new episode of military invasion of Armenian territory in the Zangezur corridor, because this is not totally unlikely. So Armenia should really try to find the creative ways to deal with the two neighbors, maybe with the support of other powerful neighbors, which are Iran and Russia. I mean, I know Iran is totally against, but I'm not sure Iran would intervene militarily on the side of Armenia.
Yeah.
If new hostilities take place there.
Yeah.
Right.
Ambassador, with the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh in 2023, Armenia faces critical legal challenges to holding Azerbaijan accountable in the current complex geopolitical atmosphere in the world. What legal mechanisms remain for seeking justice here?
Well, since Azerbaijan is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so this is not an avenue. The Human Rights Council is always a good place in Geneva to seek justice, and one way to approach this issue would be to have a special rapporteur on the situation of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh / Artsakh. And then this rapporteur could make an investigation, an inquiry into the crimes committed in the course of this invasion, and then make recommendations on how to redress the situation. A Goldstone report for that case. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that would be possible. Of course, Armenia would have to play diplomatically, but you need a majority. You don't need unanimity in the Human Rights Council. So that's about the only way I could see to have, like, at the international level, a serious process that would put some diplomatic pressure on the Azeris to do something. Now, there is in international law a basic principle regarding refugee, which is the right of return. Now, the question is how much Armenia, I think this is even a debate today in a very hot topic in Armenia domestic politics, the right of return. But in my view, this is definitely an issue which should be highlighted internationally. Maybe the International Court of Justice. I'm not sure. We should really look for legal advice on whether the International Court of Justice could rule about whether the refugees have the right to return. In my view, they do have. Maybe Armenia could ask for an advisory opinion in The Hague, in the International Court of Justice. It's not the ICC, and the International Court of Justice is tasked with ruling conflicts or disputes between states, and this is typically a dispute between states. So according to the Convention on Refugees and other legal documents, it seems to me that that court could very well establish that there is a right to return. And that would give I think that would give some leeway in Armenia in this complicated relationship with Azerbaijan. These are the two avenues I see, if you want, the International Court of Justice and the Human Rights Council. But first, what you need to do, I think, is to build some legal case that you can then bring on the international scene.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit challenging because the relationship between Armenian leader Pashinyan and Aliyev is not very equal, and there is a widespread perception that essentially it's one of capitulation. So, for instance, one of the recent manifestations is that Azerbaijan is demanding that both sides withdraw their international cases from all international courts, all legal cases. So actually,
and so far the record is that Pashinyan is constantly complying.
Yeah, so everything that Aliyev has demanded so far, Pashinyan has accepted. So if Aliyev and Pashinyan conspire to do this, is there recourse by other actors, maybe the people who suffered or other international state actors, to take legal measures?
Well, I think that a legal measure by the International Court of Justice can be ignored. Right? It's always a problem that you have no implementation enforcement mechanism in the world order. Well, at the end of the day, it's all about negotiations. But if there is enough and pressure, so if you have a case, for instance, reports from the Human Rights Council or from special rapporteur in the Human Rights Council, that this person is smart, has a high credit, can talk to the Europeans, can talk to maybe even Russia, maybe that can create some sort of diplomatic pressure. Legally speaking, I really don't. Even if the International Court of Justice would make a ruling or an advisory opinion, instead of having just a case against Azerbaijan, what they could ask is an advisory opinion, it's advisory, so it's not so legally binding, but at least you would have some
legal basis, maybe
some legal basis to then make some political demands.
Right.
And then usually at the end of the day, it's about trade-offs. Okay, I give you this, you give me that, and I'm not sure, but Armenia seems to have a very weak hand, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I would think that they could have a stronger case if they all agree. Well, first, if there is some sort of unity of action in Armenia itself, because the Armenians seem to me to be very divided also, and together with the diaspora, because the diaspora has proven to be, in the course of Armenian history, maybe the best asset for Armenia. So if the US get interested, if France gets interested, maybe other countries, then that can create some kind of a useful pressure. But of course, for that, you would need to have a clear demand of what Armenia wants, and Armenia cannot ask for the integration of Nagorno-Karabakh. I think the key issue is really the right of return today, because there is a strong legitimacy, in my view, to ask for that, and also to make sure that the culture, the Armenian culture in Nagorno-Karabakh, is not being wiped off, because there is a risk, since this region is relatively empty now, I understand, that all the traces of Armenian presence might just disappear. So I think there is a lot that could be done, but you would need. I think it would be good if somebody had a UN mandate to make proposals. I'm sorry, but there is really no silver bullet, no golden rule that can be applied. It's a very difficult situation, unfortunately. And God knows if I admire as much the Ottoman culture as I admire the Armenian culture.
You can say that Armenians had a strong part to play in the Ottoman culture as well, but that's a topic for another show, I think.
Yes.
So I do appreciate all the time you spent with us. Thank you, Ambassador Jean-Daniel Ruch.
Thank you.
And we will put the link to your book in our show notes. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure discussing with you. Thank you very much. Take care.
Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, that's our show today. This episode was recorded on February 27, 2025. We've been talking with Ambassador Jean-Daniel Ruch, who is a former Swiss diplomat. He served as Switzerland's ambassador to Serbia and Montenegro, then to Israel, and finally to Turkey. Ruch also served as a political advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Ruch studied international relations and international security in Geneva. Edition Zarqa published his book, Crimes, Hate, and Tremors, which we've talked about in June of 2024. For more information on all this stuff and the participants in this episode, check out our show notes. That's also where we are going to put the links to the book and everything else. podcasts.groong.org/episode number. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Asbed Bedrossian in Los Angeles.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan in Yerevan.
Please find us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. And the links are going to be in the show notes. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.